Hi everyone, this is Tim at North and South Podcasts. Today is a Hope Street podcast, a fantastic mental health and wellbeing charity in Ormskirk, West Lancashire, in the northwest of England. The details will be in the notes. And today I'm speaking to someone who I consider a friend and someone who I consider a little bit of a role model to me in terms of poetic output and also in terms of someone who's got bounce back ability. Today we're going to be speaking to Chris, who's a volunteer at Hope Street, about his life story and where he's been. And there may be some stuff here which may be a little bit of a trigger to some people in terms of possible issues around abuse and drug taking. So just to let you know about those now. So that will be in the notes as well, and in this podcast that it may contain some explicit content, but this is a very powerful story. It's one I've heard twice before, and it's one I'm keen to share with other people to help them as well. If you can support the podcast by sharing it, giving it to other people, reviewing it, rating it, if you want to help me and volunteer to help with the podcast, that's great. I want to do more and more work with Hope Street moving forward. And if you want to support me financially at coffee.com, the details are in the notes as well. So, Chris, thank you for giving up your time and being here tonight. I know that you've been out walking today and doing some voluntary work with other people. So tell us about your story then. Where do you want to start in terms of your life and the kind of things that you've been through?
Well, I suppose the best place to start at the beginning. You know, I mean, that's where it all comes back to, really, isn't it, with most people, childhood.
Yeah.
I mean, last October, I turned 50, and that was quite frightening, really.
Yeah.
I think, 50 years, I mean, where's that gone? At times, it seems like I've done nothing in that 50 years. But other times, when I think about it, I've actually done a hell of a lot. I mean, the people who are doing the mathematics in their head now will work out, born in 1971, that's correct. That's when I was born. And my childhood, to begin with at least, was actually quite happy. I don't really have any issues from my very early childhood. I mean, I did struggle with my speech. I didn't know at the time, but I have a condition called dyspraxia, and that affects coordination, and that can also affect speech. But back then, no one knew any of that. No one, that you were just stupid and clumsy. So I didn't speak properly till I was maybe 7. I tended to just use isolated words, not full sentences, and at times just grunts. I had my own language at one time, which my mum could understand. So she says she could anyway. It was difficult to communicate, to get my point across. It could be very frustrating. But I was happy. I'm pretty sure I wasn't unhappy at that time. My mum was she was a good mum. She struggled a lot. My dad left when I was about 6 when he left. About 8 when they got divorced, and I didn't see a great deal of him afterwards. I mean, my mum never stopped him from seeing us, but he was. I don't think he was that interested.
Yeah.
He didn't live far away. He didn't live that far away either. I used to sort of see him in the street. And he married a woman who lived just up the road. So I couldn't really avoid seeing him, but there was no formal sort of contact.
Do you know when you were at school and, you said you weren't diagnosed with dyspraxia, and there's a lot of stuff now like dyslexia, ADHD, and a lot of things which, probably people were just labeled as stupid or not quite right many, many years ago. Do you feel like you were labeled in school as someone who, had learning difficulties? Or, I mean, you said you had a happy childhood. Did you feel labeled in any way at that age? Or did you just kind of go with the flow?
I felt labeled as stupid. I don't recall anybody using such a term as learning difficulties back then.
Yeah.
I mean, later on, I did work with adults with learning difficulties. I mean, there's been various terms used throughout the years. But back then, pretty much, we were just stupid. We couldn't do certain things, you know.
Yeah.
And this was a time when teachers didn't think anything of using such words either to children. I mean, it's often said that the 70s was a very different world, and it was. You know, I mean, some of the things teachers did back then, you know, they'd be in prison for now. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah. I was telling
cash,
some students in my class about, I remember when they got rid of teachers being able to hit students in about 91, 92, something like that. Because I got hit in year 7 by my maths teacher who gave me a knock on the back of the head. I wasn't even a bad student. And the student's jaws hit the floor. But when I was at school, it was quite often that you would hear a teacher ridiculing a student in the classroom.
yeah.
And that was just what some teachers did sometimes. And I think we've certainly come a long way since then, but it does have an impact on you, those kind of things. When it's, I think, targeted at you, or when you see it, it almost normalizes it, doesn't it?
It does. And casual violence, casual cruelty should never be normalized, in my
Yeah.
opinion. It should always be the extreme. But sadly, it was the norm. And I have to say, although I didn't like it, obviously, no one liked it, I don't think any of us thought it was something out of the ordinary. It was just the way it was.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it was just the way it was. And I mean, if I got in trouble at school, if I went home and told me mum and dad that I'd been in trouble, they'd say, well, don't do it again. There was an automatic assumption that you shouldn't. And in many ways, that's good to some extent, but also people need to go, well, what was actually said or what actually happened? You need to scratch the surface and just make sure that the things are done properly. But you said you generally had a happy childhood then.
Yeah, certainly up to about 11. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would say generally there were the ups and downs that every child has. You know, people often ask me if I felt abandoned by my dad, and I have to say I don't recall feeling it. I don't think at times later in my life I've looked back and wondered what was going through his head and what his motivations were. But at the time, I don't recall thinking deeply on it. It was just the way it was.
Yeah, it's funny when you're young, it just things are just the way they are. And when you're older, you start to scratch the surface a little bit, don't you? So what happened at 11 then? You said at age 11, you hinted then that things started to change or something happened when you were that age?
Well, 11, there were two things that happened when I was 11. And I can't in my mind place which of them happened first. People could make some assumptions if they wanted to psychoanalyze. One of the things that happened was that I was abused by a family member, sexually abused by a family member. I'm saying it only happened once. Obviously, once is too many times. I'm not clear in my head why it only happened once, because there were opportunities it could have happened again. There were opportunities before when it could have happened and didn't happen. So I don't know what it was about that circumstance where I was alone with this person. There'd been other times when it could have happened, but for whatever reason, I was sexually abused on that occasion, and nobody else knew about this until very, very recently. About that particular occasion. Although I have spoken about other abuse in my life, until I did a talk at Hope Street, I'd always kept that bit back.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure why that one felt harder to come up with than others, and than harder to talk about. But I don't know. The second thing that happened when I was 11, as I say, I can't quite place which of these came first, was that I began to develop problems with eating. Now, I don't recall having any issues with eating before that.
Yeah.
And that is one problem which I still struggle with now, all these years later. That's gone on pretty much since I was 11.
And are we talking about overeating or undereating or
both?
All right.
Yeah, both. I mean, people often think, you're either anorexic or you're bulimic. It's not as clear cut as that.
Mm.
You can be both or neither and still have an eating disorder. I mean, I don't recall it being called an eating disorder at the time. I think I was just labelled as a funny eater.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember that term. Oh yeah, he's a bit of a funny eater for someone who didn't eat dinner at school, or again, they were lazy times, weren't they, in terms of appreciating certain things like that. That obviously went on that people might not have discussed openly. And it's interesting you say you can't remember which of those two events came first, because they may well have been causally linked, or maybe it was just.
Well, yes. I mean, that is the assumption that's generally made when I talk about it, and I'm not saying that that's not the case. I'm just
Yeah,
saying I can't say for certain.
yeah, yeah. One of the things I noticed is that I've heard you speak about the sexual abuse at the two Hope Street meetings, because do you think they were 2 years apart, and some people hadn't heard it because we have lots of new people coming, and I'd never heard anyone talk like that about anything like that, and I felt that you were very calm and measured in talking about it. You said you hadn't talked about it before. And do you think that mentally it was now something that you could talk about after all that time? Or are you unsure why you felt comfortable? Or was it just because of the forum, maybe at a Wellbeing charity, that you felt comfortable with those people?
Well, I didn't feel comfortable saying it, no. Any more than I feel comfortable saying it now. But it was a case of, I felt it was then or never.
Yeah, yeah.
I felt I had a responsibility to say it, because I always had this theory that in any room, any group of people, if you're talking about abuse, there'll be somebody there who either has experienced it or will experience it, or knows somebody who is experiencing it at that time. And they need to know that they are not alone.
Yeah, yeah.
I just felt I had to say it there and then. And I've no idea if it helped people or not, but it helped me, as I say, as much as I don't find it easy to talk about.
Yeah.
I always think it's better talked about than not talked about. I think if you don't talk about things, they fester inside of you, and ultimately you make yourself ill.
Yeah, I think that's important. People often say that with trauma, it's better to, if you like, take control of the memory of it and be not okay with it, but be able to think about it and be able to move on from it. Which again, I'm not qualified to talk about. I know that there's counselling techniques which are channeled towards that kind of thing, but I certainly was very, very moved by what you'd said, and I think everyone in the room was very moved and learned a lot. And there were obviously people in the room who'd been directly affected by it as well. And I was really taken aback with how brave you were saying it. But I think you're right. I think when you get these messages out, if you've been through difficult events in your life, there is a level of good work about getting it out there and saying, we need to talk about these things. And I think that what you did was very brave, but very, very important.
I'll just say also that I was asked by somebody afterward why I didn't name the person, and I said I work on the assumption that do the least harm you can.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact, and I can't really go into any more detail without straying too close to the realm of identifying, but it would, to name this person would do no good at all and only do harm. The person in question is no longer with us, the dead.
Yeah.
So, but it would hurt other people, and I see no valid reason to do that. What does anyone get out of it? Nothing, in my opinion.
Again, I think that's they're very wise words. You do need to think about, what are the reasons for saying these things? Will it serve any purpose? That's obviously, there are two things which are going to have a big impact on you at the age of 11. How did you find becoming a teenager? You've already been through some very traumatic events, some adverse childhood experiences, which are going to have a big impact on anyone. How were you able to navigate school, education, and the teenage years after what you've been through?
Secondary school, what they call high school now, it was like entering a torture chamber. Yeah. That's how it felt at the time, in a lot of different ways. So many more kids, so many more big kids, kids from outside of the area who I didn't know, a lot more bullies, a lot of bigger bullies. And in amongst all this, was me, and I wasn't entirely sure who I was, what I was going to be. I was also at the time debating trying to work out what my sexual orientation was.
Yeah.
I was confused about that. I knew about gay people. I knew about heterosexual people. Nobody had ever, and I don't recall seeing it anywhere. Yeah. I had no concept of bisexual. I didn't know such a thing existed, or that you could be such a thing. I thought you were one or the other. So that was somewhat confusing, because I knew I was attracted to both sexes. So I didn't. So I thought there was something odd about me. So there was that as well. So that I didn't know anybody else in that position or that situation. That threw me. When I was 12 or 13 is when I first saw this. I think they called him an educational psychologist. I think that was the title. I had issues. That's the way it was worded. I had issues. Obviously, there was the eating thing, although I'd learnt to hide it a lot better by that point. So that didn't always come up as much. There was also things like I had trouble sleeping, and then other times they couldn't get me out of bed. I think my mum was a bit perplexed, because I'd always been pretty good at junior school. I'd always got up, gone. I'd always seemed mostly full of the joys of spring, as she put it. Obviously, she didn't know what had happened with the abuse, and she knew I had some issue with eating, but that was just me being funny, a bit of a funny eater. She didn't know about the sexual orientation thing at that point. So from her point of view, I had issues. I was being strange, and somebody at the school, I don't know who, suggested to her that I should see this person, this educational psychologist. I remember going and speaking to them. It was a room in the doctor's surgery where I went, and I just remember being given these tests. I couldn't tell you what tests they were, and I had to answer questions and tick boxes and things like that. And at the end, he took it away and hummed and hawed and looked at it, and then apparently the report came back that I was above average intelligence, and he'll be fine. He's just being a teenager. Don't worry about it. And that was that. At that time, anyway.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays, I know in my school we have like an LGBTQIA plus club for kids, and it's more discussed. Yeah. And when I think back about like some of the things we've discussed, like having a particular learning difficulty or being unsure about sexual orientation, when I was growing up, I was born in 1977, so I was born after you. It was still tough. And a lot of people today think, oh, it's great today, isn't it? The way things are discussed. And you go, well, yeah, but it wasn't long ago. I mean, it was only, I think, just over 50 years ago when homosexuality was first made legal, or it wasn't prosecuted anymore. And we know what it's like in some parts of the world. And then you've got the issues with the trans community and ongoing persecution and discrimination of people, not just in the developing world, but in very much the developed world. But it sounds very much like you could have done with what maybe considered a bit more of a modern perspective on things. And
Absolutely.
this idea that, oh, don't worry, he's okay, he's above level intelligence, everything's going to be fine. You know, it wasn't, was it? And,
No.
you know, that let you down, didn't it? I think looking at that, you know, you needed someone to talk to, I think, looking back, and that wasn't forthcoming. Did you find anyone who you could talk to about any of these issues, even if it was a friend or?
Not at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, later on, well, if I get to about when I was about 14, a number of things happened at that point. It probably seems all at once because it all happened when I was 14, but of course that's a 12-month period. I met this lad he came to the school from somewhere else. His name was Simon, and we became good friends. I'm not quite sure how he singled me out or why he singled me out. I mean, if I was writing a script about this, I'd write something in where I was being bullied by somebody, because I was bullied by a bit. Yeah. I'd write something like that in, and then Simon would come along and, you know, and sort the bullies out. But it didn't work. It wasn't like that. You know, that's how I would write it if I was writing a script. But that's not what happened. Somehow we just started talking to each other. I found that in my life, to be honest, with relationships. I tended to just fall into them of any kind, friendships or whatever. It just seems to happen. We became very close because I talked to him about a lot of things. I didn't talk to him about the abuse. As I say, I didn't discuss that with anybody. But I think he surmised that there was something like that at the back of it. He was very clever. He was very empathetic. He could read people, which I do myself. But his skill at doing it was quite uncanny in many ways. It was almost like he was psychic. He could read people very, very well. We became very close. We became more than friends, to be honest, at a certain point. And he was my first relationship, first sexual relationship as well. I still have very warm feelings about him. He despite when I get to the next part of the story, people often react negatively about him. At a certain point, Simon began using drugs. Initially, it was just cannabis initially, and in the nature of things, of course, I started down that route as well because we did everything together. We did all sorts together. So it was just natural that what he did, I did. You know, I mean, we'd drink a bit as well, but drink wasn't a huge thing back then for me.
Yeah.
It was more other stuff. We graduated, you know, before long to harder stuff. And where he went, I followed pretty much. You know, cocaine, then heroin. Because I know that before I turned 15, I was still 14. I was already a heroin addict. So it always seems like a hell of a lot happened all at once.
Yeah.
And that's why I say that people sometimes, when I talk about this, are often critical of Simon, because it's like he came along and then suddenly he'd got me into drugs. But life isn't as clear cut as that. I made my own choices, you know, ill-advised ones though they were. I don't blame him for it. You know, I did what I did, and it's no one's fault but mine. I would never say otherwise. I mean, the next stage of the story is, I mean, as I'm sure you know, addicts will do whatever they have to do to get drugs. You know, they'll steal, they'll cheat, they'll lie, they'll do whatever. And the next stage it came to, this was something that Simon told me about. He knew this man hung around the local park. I don't know what his name was. Never did know what his name was. But this man basically was into young boys, and he always had money. This fella. I don't know how, He didn't seem to do any work, but he always had money. And young boys, he would pay young boys to do things. And I say Simon discovered him first, so he told me about it, and I don't honestly recall hesitating. I just thought it's a way of getting money. It's a way of feeding this habit. I don't care what it is, I'll do it. How that feeds back into my earlier abuse, I couldn't say. Maybe my senses were dimmed, maybe my self-worth was non-existent. I don't know. In any case, I just did whatever I did, and it was all about getting the money, all about the addiction. Nothing else was important.
So this is while you're still at school, isn't it? So
Oh yeah,
obviously,
yeah.
this is going to have a big impact on how you do at school.
Yeah.
Did you leave school at 16 or before then? How did your
I left at 16, but I mean that was quite common back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I left school at 16. I did go to college for a bit. I have to say I did pass my exams, by the way. Not brilliantly,
Yeah.
but I scraped through. But then I was always somebody who could walk into an exam with no revision of any kind and just do it. So I did manage to scrape through then. I mean, around that same time when I was leaving, that was when my mum found out about the drug problem. It wasn't something that she could handle. It was something entirely out of her experience. I should say by this point she knew about my relationship with Simon.
Yeah.
She knew that about sexual orientation, and although she struggled with that, she accepted it. It was something outside of her realm of experience. She just didn't understand it, but she accepted it. That was me. That was who I was. I was happy. That was it. But the drugs were just something she could not get her head around, because she'd never had any experience of that sort of thing. She didn't know anybody who had, and it was just something that she found impossible to cope with. She did give me an ultimatum. It was I either packed it in or I stayed. Did stop for a while, but it didn't last long. So I did end up leaving home for a while. Well, because she couldn't. I say my mum couldn't cope with it. I was homeless for a short while, which isn't. It sounds obvious to say, but isn't a pleasant experience. It's very, very frightening. And of course, people prey on you. Predators of all kinds. At that time, I lost touch with Simon. I seem to remember. Yes, I lost touch with Simon. He went off. He went off to live down south. I seem to remember. Yes, he went off to live down south, and we sort of lost touch for a while. Around that time, I had a relationship with a girl, and I stopped doing drugs for a while. I mean, to be honest, the next couple of years of this similar sort of story. I moved back home, left home, moved back home, left home. Stopped taking drugs, went back on them. Stopped taking drugs, went back on them. In and out of relationships, and none of them seemed to last very long, which is mostly my fault. But then I was sectioned for brief time when I was 19. That was combination both of that. Wasn't just about the drugs. That was mainly because I decided, for reasons I can't really remember, to just stop eating altogether. I just thought, that's it. I'm not eating anymore. I've had enough. Yeah, I just thought, I don't want food. I hate the thought of food being in my body. It's horrible stuff. I'm just not going to eat it. So, because if you don't eat, well, it's obvious what happens, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was sectioned then for a short time. I was 19 then. I had therapy. Again, nobody ever seemed to get to the abuse part thing. But I don't think anyone was actually searching for it. Which now I think they probably would. I think they would sort of assume there was some kind of complex trauma at the back of it and would search for it. But I don't think no one seemed to then. I mean, I was asked a few questions about my childhood. They seemed very focused on this thing about my dad leaving.
Yeah,
They seem to have an obsession with that.
yeah, yeah. Without realizing that there were other major
Yeah,
things. I mean, that's very much an ideological limit, isn't it? At the time, I suppose that.
yeah,
I mean, some of the things we've discussed, they just weren't really talked about at school. We
no,
hear a lot today about safeguarding and understanding of people with additional needs, etc., etc. But it never used to be like that. And it sounds like you've gone through. There was a lot of signs there that maybe something wasn't right, and you could have done with some help. And you've been knocked from pillar to post. You've been through unbelievable things, and you're 19. You've almost seen it all by the age of 19. And I think for anyone listening, I think it's remarkable really to hear you talking about this now. I mean, I know you could meet a nicer person, very well rounded. To go through all this, it must have made a big impact then, and still now. And as you say, people just weren't looking for those things back then, were they? I think that's a sad thing, really, that, it's quite, I mean, you hear stories, don't you, oh, look how these children were treated, and we need to improve our systems,
yeah.
Victoria Columbia in cases like that. But not long ago, there was none of this stuff, and a lot of people slipped through the net who needed help. And I think you were let down, mate. Looking at it, I think you were let down. How do you feel about it now, looking back in terms of,
How do I feel? How do I feel about how I was treated?
just
Or
about?
how,
I mean, when people ask me about my youth, I could say, yeah, that wasn't very good. But I've been asked about my youth, and people say, like, what would you change about that? And I always say, like, well, not really, because I've learned from all the things that have happened. But it's a bit of a false question, isn't it, in many ways?
I'm a bit angry at times, but then I sometimes think, you know, it was I suppose everyone was coming from a place of ignorance, weren't they?
Yeah,
So so I don't know who to be angry at, really.
yeah,
So I don't know, and it's very true when people say that, I could, if someone gave me the power now to go and change all that, to change all my childhood and teenage years. I mean, I could do all that, but then I'm not sure I'd be me. I'm
yeah,
not sure I'd
yeah,
be the same person I am now, because I certainly wouldn't have got involved with Hope Street,
yeah,
and it will never have occurred to me to do so.
yeah,
I, I, I think most people who don't struggle with any kind of issues of that kind doesn't occur to them most of the time to get involved in things like that.
yeah,
Because they're just living the life, aren't they?
yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't think I would change it if I could, if I had the power to do it. I don't think I would. As I say, occasionally I get angry, but it's an unfocused anger because I don't know who I'm supposed to be angry
Yeah.
at.
Well, I think the systemic issues, aren't there? And as you say, like, people might say, "Oh, Simon led you astray," and you think, "Well, no, it was a bit more complex than that." I still got fond memories of Simon, etc.
Oh, I have.
And
Yeah.
it's far more complex than just naming individuals and individual events. But I mean, we'll come to Hope Street later. I think you found Hope Street an unbelievable focus of assistance for you. And I remember when you did your first speech, you said, "This, when I found Hope Street, it kind of changed my life. I saw something in Hope Street that I found very helpful." And you've been involved in a number of different things, but there's still quite a bit of time before you come to Hope Street. So what happened after 19 then? You're in and out of your mother's home, you've been homeless, you've been sectioned for not eating. What happens as you go into your 20s?
As I went into my 20s, what mainly happened was that I met somebody. I mean, I'd met lots of people before, as we've been through, but this person was different. At least she seemed so at the time.
Yeah,
A lady called Julie. To me, she was important enough to finally try and crack this drug addiction. She was somebody I cared enough to do it for. perhaps I should say, when I say do it for her, we mainly do it for ourselves.
Yeah.
People want to give up for themselves, but I felt in a place where there was something worth giving up for, whereas I hadn't really felt that before. There was still a lot of backwards and forwards, falling backwards. That went on for a couple of years, but I made a commitment to try to stop, and in the end, I did. I finally stopped when I was about, I was 22 was the last time I took heroin. I have to say, I did occasionally still smoke cannabis for a couple of years afterwards, but eventually I stopped doing that as well. But 22 was when I last took drugs. But there's another side to the tale. In order to try and help me with that, I did something which everyone tells you not to do. Even then, they told you not to do it. I replaced one drug with another.
Yeah.
I started drinking more and a lot heavier, thinking that afterwards I could just pack that in, because I'd never been a huge drinker before. I drank, I drank if I was in pubs, or I might have a can occasionally, but I was never a huge drinker. I mean, I come from a family with, my mum never drank. My dad didn't really drink. He didn't like the taste. Grandparents didn't drink. So it was never part of my life as a child. I know, and I didn't like the taste. I still don't like the taste. So it was never a big thing, but all of a sudden there it was. However, it wasn't as straightforward as seeming like. It didn't seem like a problem at the time. I'd stopped the drugs, so it seemed like everything was brilliant, like everything was fine. It seemed like on a new chapter. And me and Julie got married, which was something I'd never thought I would do. I often wonder. I mean, she was big on getting married. She didn't want to just live together. If I'm honest, I was probably indifferent. It wouldn't have bothered me if we hadn't got married. But if I'm honest, I think that was the case. I don't think I was that fussed whether we did or not. But that's what she wanted, so we did. I have to say, the first few years were great. I was drinking, obviously, and that was getting heavier and heavier. But most of the time, things went fine. We had some good times. We were both working. I I did I did a I did a lot of different jobs back then. Made a lot of admin work. I became a teaching assistant, but that was later on. But a lot of the time I worked in offices. I could spend this podcast going through the jobs I did in my life. It was great, but I wasn't really aware for a while. I'm quite blind when it comes to love. I don't really spot faults in people when I love them. I'm convinced now that Julie had some sort of personality disorder. I'm convinced of it. I mean, she was very self-centered in lots of ways, but then so were lots of people. So I didn't really hold that against her. She could get wound up about little things and get annoyed. And again, this is where I take my share of the blame. Obviously, she didn't like me getting drunk all the time. But we were probably together about 3 or 4 years before it became a big issue. The first thing I remember happening of any significance is I came home from somewhere completely drunk. She got out of the bed and said, you're not getting here, not in that state, which was fair enough. So I struggled up and I started to wander off to the spare bedroom. And then I just suddenly remember this pain in the back of my head. And she hit me over the back of the head with this. It wasn't a poker exactly. It was like a poker. It was an ornament that we had. And she hit me with that, or just like that. Just even though I did what she asked me to do. I was going, and suddenly smack. I wasn't knocked out because I've got quite a hard head, but that's the first time I remember that happening. And then it just seemed to. I just put that down to me being an idiot and being drunk and getting on the
Mm.
nerve, and just thought, wasn't nice, but fair enough. And then there were just other incidences. She would just suddenly fly off the handle. She would break things. She would break things all of a sudden, and she would suddenly lash out and hit me. And I wasn't told when I was drunk. This it could be if I disagreed with her. We were talking over something at breakfast, and she'd see. I'm without wishing to big myself up. I'm quite well read. I've always read a lot, and I've read a lot of things. I know a lot of things. Julie wasn't particularly a reader. She didn't, and once she mentioned something about it was something to do with history and some figure or other, and I said, oh, that's not true. I said, so that's a common. I can't remember who it was specifically. I said it's a common misconception that actually blah 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 blah. And she really didn't like that. She went mad. She went mad. So it was little things like that. Sometimes she would really get worked up, and the violence thing became more and more frequent to the point where I had to go to hospital a couple of times. I went once because she stabbed me in the wrist with this carving knife. She was I can't remember what I told them at the hospital. I had to tell them something, some story or other, and they seemed to accept it. I don't think it was a very convincing story myself, but they didn't seem to question anything. Again, maybe that's something that's changed as well.
Yeah.
At a later point as well. Obviously, people who drink a lot aren't great when it comes to sex. And I wasn't particularly. And at times that would frustrate Julie. So the abuse at one point turned from physical abuse to sexual abuse. Actually, if I was in bed drunk and she suddenly decided that she wanted sex, then she would take it, which again isn't something that is commonly spoken about even now. I don't think it was spoken about at all then.
Yeah. That's a difficult time for you then, because you've got physical and sexual issues and also anger issues, and yet you and Julie had a child together, didn't you? And was that in the midst of those kind of things? Were those things fully formed, those issues in your relationship, when you had your daughter Hayley?
I should say first of all that we didn't plan to have any children,
Yeah.
even before we started, even before any of this. I also think, to give her credit, Julie recognised that she had had issues, and plus she was quite self-centered. So and a child requires a lot of looking after, so it wasn't planned. But things being what they are, the nature of things, obviously things happen, and she became pregnant. And then a very interesting thing happened. As soon as she realised she actually was pregnant, she changed to a great degree. I don't mean that she became this fantastic person overnight, but she loved being pregnant, and she loved the thought of having a child. And I didn't to begin with. I hate to say that, but at the time I didn't like the idea at all. But I thought, it's where we are, so we'll have to get on with it. The violence more or less stopped at that point, because she wasn't stupid. She wasn't going to try and get into fights when she was pregnant.
Yeah.
I'd love to say that I suddenly stopped drinking, but I didn't. It's not as simple as that. And then Hayley came along, and as I say, I was transformed in that sense. In that, as soon as I saw her, I thought I was just amazed, and I didn't know that such beauty existed in the world. Julie, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that she was obsessed. With Hayley. She sort of went from being obsessed about herself, being obsessed about Hayley. Our relationship, it got better in some ways. The violence wasn't there, but I did give up. I gave up drinking for a while. I do remember that. think about a year. Yeah. The first year of her life, I don't think I drank at all. I just concentrated on my work and just trying to look after them. I also think that Julie was she was very possessive of a child. I think in an ideal world, she wouldn't have wanted me around. I think she was like, just had this child to herself and nobody else. I think that's the way her mind began to turn. I mean, she never managed to achieve getting rid of me in that sense, although we did eventually decide that being together wasn't in the best interests of our daughter. You know, children know when the parents aren't happy. Children see everything. You know, if anyone thinks that the child doesn't notice things, they're very much mistaken. They do. They notice everything. It was slightly made easier by the fact that Julie found somebody else. Funnily enough, a man I used to know many years before, in my addict days, although he'd left all that behind him. But he turned up about a few months before, came to see me, and I made it clear at the time I wasn't interested in being involved with anybody who, from that time,
Yeah.
good for me.
You didn't want that to come back into your life, as it were.
No, and I never particularly liked him back then, to be honest. He wasn't a particularly nice person, but somehow him and Julie got involved. I mean, I didn't know initially, but it wasn't that long before I found out.
Were you still living with Julie at this time, or did you move
when they got together? Yes, but we had pretty much decided that we were going to split up for reasons I can't honestly remember. I was reluctant to go back to my mum's. We were getting on fine, but I wanted to try and find somewhere else and not go back to my mum's. In the end, I did go back to my mum's. I couldn't find anywhere else. Not in the time I wanted to get out in. As I say, them two got together. I've often been asked if it was hurtful, them two getting together, and my honest answer is it was mostly relief. It felt easier going if she had somebody else.
Yeah. You move out, and I'm just going to prepare people for this, because when you first said this to me, this next bit, well, maybe we're not quite there yet, but I was really taken aback when you talked about what happened with Hayley. And the second time as well, with people there who'd not heard it before, who were quite shocked. So how long after you had left Julie and Hayley with Julie's new partner, did those tragic events happen with Hayley?
It was about 4 years later, because we split up when Hayley was about 2.
Right.
So and the next 4 years were happy for me mostly. I mean, I emphasize mostly not drinking, and I saw as much of my daughter as I could. I mean, I would have been happy with seeing her more, but can't have everything in life, and so they were mostly happy. Yeah. Then we get to the events you're referring to. I got a phone call. This was when Hayley was 6. I got a phone call to say that she was in hospital with suspected meningitis. So I raced off to the hospital, and I got there, and by the time I got there, she was in a very bad way. Hayley, that is. I went and sat by the bed. Julie was there, and although I knew it was bad, and Julie knew it was bad, I don't think either of us. I think the thought of what happened was just too immense that it just wasn't conceivable. That could possibly happen. And then, of course, it did. She died. Hayley died. I remember being told that she was dead. Well, we were being told that she was dead by the doctor, or Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was a doctor, and I just remember the I just remember not being able to hear it. Well, I could hear it, but it was like it was coming from a long way away.
Yeah.
Like, excuse me, like it was coming from the end of a tunnel, and I remember Julie screaming, and I've never. I think if I live to the end of my day, if I live another 100 years, I don't think I'll ever hear a sound of such pain in my life. I hope I never hear anything like that again, ever. It's just horrible. And I remember her screaming and shouting at me, asking, why it couldn't be me that was dead, and I quite agreed with her. Quite happily, yes, please, if we can change places, I'll do it now. I said what I said actually a couple of days after to somebody, and I still mean it. If I could have, if the devil had come to me then and said, everyone else in this hospital has to die to save your daughter, I'd say, do it now, no hesitation. And I think I still would say that.
So
I don't feel any guilt for saying that either.
is this about 2007, Chris, when we lost Hayley?
2008.
2008, yeah. Right.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, 2008. Yeah. Yeah.
What was that like for you? I mean, obviously, Julie, you mentioned. What was that like for you at the time? I know grief needs to take its time, etc. But how did that impact on you at the time? I mean, it just beggars belief, really. But
I don't know. I always felt guilty that I didn't cry.
yeah,
I have cried since. I just felt like it was sort of beyond that kind of thing. I mean, I also wasn't much help to Julie. I couldn't do anything. I think I remember sitting there for ages. I don't think I moved for about an hour. People kept speaking to me and I was ignoring them.
I can't imagine that. I mean, my son's 2.5. I just couldn't imagine that. And I've got a friend who's lost his son, and I just can't imagine that. And you've been through a lot already, and then this happened. I mean, you must have felt like, why me? Did you feel like that at the time?
Yeah.
Because I just
Yeah, I did, and I felt guilty for thinking that. I felt so angry. And again, who are you angry at? I'm quite certain that the medical professionals all did everything that they possibly could. How can you be angry at an illness or a disease? You can't, can you? I mean, I just don't know who to be angry at. I'm angry at myself sometimes, but then I didn't do any. It's not my fault either. There's just nowhere to direct the anger.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, that's a theme that you've mentioned already in your life. There's that anger, but who you're angry with, who you're angry against, it's hard to identify it. But I mean, again, there's another thing you're going to tell us in a moment about what happened with Julie after that. She didn't deal very well with the loss of Hayley. I mean, I don't suppose anyone would, but she wasn't able to get back into a normal life,
no,
as it were. And you said that a few years later, I think was it 2 years, 3 years later, she
it was 4 years later.
4 years was it? Sorry,
2012. Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry.
So she died then, and you said that after Hayley had gone, she just couldn't cope with that, and her life just went on a downward trajectory. Is that how you remember it?
Yes, it has to be said. I didn't. After the funeral, Hayley's funeral, that is, we didn't see a great deal of each other. I mean, that's down to two. One, she didn't particularly want to see me. I think I reminded her too much of things, and a lot of the time, I didn't particularly want to see her, which doesn't sound very pleasant. I know, but it's the truth. And I mean, we did see each other. I mean, with the war, we did see each other from time to time, but it was just too painful for us most of the time. I mean, I became aware at one point that she, because her partner contacted me, and I knew how serious it was because he contacted me, because he wouldn't have contacted me, but he didn't want to contact me. Just say we didn't like each other, but the fact that he contacted me, he was genuinely scared. He was worried something was going to happen to her, and he wanted my help. But for a while, we had this regime, me or him or various other people, members of a family. She had quite a big family. Would watch her, sometimes sit up with her all night. But as I'm sure you know, as I'm sure many people know, there is only so much you can do.
Yeah.
Stop somebody from, if someone is determined to end their life, there's only so much you can do. You can't watch them 24 hours a day. And eventually she did, because I think it was just too painful for her to go on. People have asked me how I feel about it. I feel nothing but sadness. My thoughts on what comes after death vary all the time. Sometimes I think one thing, sometimes I think another. The answer is I don't know, and nobody actually knows. But if there is something, I hope that she's in a place of peace and happiness there, and that is what I wish for her.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've lost people, extended family, and I always feel that there's, regardless of what happens, and I always feel that there's peace involved in it. I don't know how, I can't explain it, but as you say, you just hope that someone's at peace, and that the pain that they've been feeling is no longer, their day-to-day reality, because that's just such a tragic story. And this is 2012, and Hope Street, I think you joined Hope Street in 2020, and then I first heard your story just at the end of 2019, sorry, and then I heard your story in 2020. It's amazing where these 2 years have gone with COVID. So there's another 8 years before you come to Hope Street. I know that you've got a lot of other things that you do. You're a great poet. I've read some of your poetry, and we'll put some links to that in the notes. You do creative writing courses, which I've been to and I really enjoy. You're a volunteer at Hope Street. You get involved in a lot at Hope Street, such as the Wellbeing walks that you do twice a week. You're involved in all the meetings. You volunteer with Hope Street, and the hub is going to be opening soon in Ormskirk Centre, which is an actual place that is just Hope Street rather than Hope Street using different venues. You're also being involved in local politics as well. So are you involved in, is it a parish council? That's still something you do?
A town council, we call it.
Town council, that's it.
It's got the same powers as the parish council, yes.
Yeah, and I know that, sorry, just want to say as well, you're involved in a lot of campaigns. I've seen you doing campaigns for the NHS and different things as well. So between 2012 and Hope Street, obviously you're someone who likes to keep busy. You're a creative person. You like to write. You like to try and make the world better. You're very compassionate. You care for others. And as you said before, coming to Hope Street, you found it like a community, almost a family thing, that you say, I'm so happy that I'm at Hope Street now, and that if I hadn't been through what I'd been through, I wouldn't be here today. So what happened over those 8 years then after, Julie's death?
Well,
mostly, until you joined Hope Street.
Well, mostly I stayed sober. That's
good.
One thing.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, I remember after Julie died, I had a pretty huge relapse. That's also the time when I was last banned from driving. I went, and I haven't actually driven since, although my ban was up some time ago. So most of that time I've stayed sober, as I said. Excuse me. I've did quite a lot of things over that period. Tried to get my life a bit more structured. I was tired of doing, different jobs and things like that. I was in a relationship for a few of them years. That ended in 2015. But it ended perfectly amicably. I got more into my writing then. I mean, I'd always been doing writing. I've never not written. But I've been saying for, I don't know how many years that I was going to publish a book, and it's just something I just never got around to. Not that I did. I had the material. I just hadn't got around to literally putting it together. So that's something I finally did in the end, and that was published in 2018. Doesn't seem that long ago.
And that's A Forest and Other Poems, is it?
That's the one, yeah. Forest and
Yeah.
Other Poems.
Which is, I've read that. It's technically, we recently did the poetry night, and you read some of that poetry and also some newer poetry out, which was very good. And I think it's a good achievement. I mean, I've wrote quite a few poems. I've had a couple published in like amateur poetry things, but to actually get a book together with your name on, that's a good achievement. And you feel like there's a bit of finality to it, all that creative process. All of a sudden you've got that kind of end product, as it were. And that was in 2018 you did that?
Yes. I mean, in ideal times I would have done another one sooner, but I intended to do one in 2020, but we all know what happened in 2020, don't we?
Yeah. I think I recall you had quite a difficult lockdown, and I know I really struggled with the second lockdown in winter. Sorry, I think it was technically the third lockdown, January to March of 2021, and I had a terrible time. I stopped coming to the Zoom chats that we did at Hope Street when we couldn't meet, because I just was having a bit of a downer. But I know that you found the first one very tough as well. Because of the loss of structure, etc. Now, I had a young child and I was working from home, as a teacher, and we had the computer that you could work down, and that kind of gave me a bit of structure. There was nice weather, but I think COVID, I think you said that, and you're certainly not the only one. I think there's going to be a huge amount of issues with the COVID generation for young people and anyone affected by it going forward. It has made a big impact on so many people's lives. But you did struggle, and do you want to talk a little bit about that, or how did you feel during the lockdowns?
I felt cut off. Just felt like I was on a desert island. And of course, Hope Street stopped because we were using the Chapel Gallery at that time, and that shut. So we did do the Zooms, but I found the Zooms difficult. I just couldn't connect in the same way with people.
I was exactly the same. Same.
I started drinking again at that point. I relapsed. I was drinking every day, mostly during that first lockdown. But I remember one time I was sat there. I was walking. I managed to get myself out of the house. I was walking along. I was actually walking along with a bottle in my hand, actually, drinking out of it. It must have been pure coincidence. Sheila from Hope Street rang me. I think she was just doing her check-in, with various people. Now that day, I felt so low. I don't know when I last felt so low before that. I actually felt like I couldn't go on.
Yeah.
But I just can't go. I can't go on with this anymore. But it's just too hard. I am actually convinced that if Sheila hadn't rung me that day, and I'm not sure. I don't think I'd be here now. I think I'd reached the end of my tether. And I felt like there was nobody out there. I should stress that I wasn't as involved with Hope Street then as I am now.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't doing any of the things that I do now for Hope Street at all. I just attended sessions, but just to have that phone call, just to see that I was all right, it made me feel like there was something worth carrying on for. So that made a huge difference. I mean, it didn't stop me drinking. It didn't happen until we were out of lockdown, but it did lift my spirits a bit.
I think that's very important. And I know that when we resumed the Hope Street meetings, you spoke quite early on when the sessions resumed. And I first heard your life story, and I was really taken aback by it. And you mentioned something about Hope Street then, about how important it was and how you'd found something. And I think you mentioned Sheila's call.
Yeah.
The community aspect of Hope Street, I think, we have loads of sessions going on different days of the week. I always go to the Tuesday sessions because, my job and my son, but I love those Tuesday sessions and I look forward to them. And it's a big part of my weekly routine, going to Hope Street. seeing everyone, saying hello, learning something new. To what extent, I think you've said before that you found Hope Street to be like the answer to some of your problems, but obviously not like, as if you come to Hope Street and all your problems are gone. But I think you feel like all your life you've struggled to cope and keep going, and you've been a bit let down by different people in different ways, etc. And it's led to where you are today. But what's your experience been of mental health support through the traditional routes, etc.? Because I think you feel like you were missed out until Hope Street comes along, which isn't technically a provision of government or local government. It's we talk a lot now about social prescribing, where a doctor, instead of saying take these antidepressants, take these, go there, whatever. Oh, by the way, there's a group that does meetings and things like that. You found that really helpful. What was your experience of mental health and wellbeing support before you found Hope Street? Including medication, by the way. I mean, feel free to talk about or not talk about medication.
Pretty poor, to be honest. As we said, a lot of the time I didn't seek it out. But, I mean, going back to when I was, that time I was sectioned, I mean, I pretty much told people what they wanted to hear so I could get released, because I didn't like being there, and I thought, so I'll just play the game to get out, which of course isn't getting to the problem, isn't it? It's not getting to the root of the problem. I've had counselling, I've had various therapies, I've had CBT and EMDR, but the counselling wasn't bad. But look, I find counsellors somewhat maddening, because sometimes you want them to say something, they don't really say much. They just, they're listening, and sometimes I would like them to say something, but they don't. Therapies, CBT didn't really do much for me, but then I know a lot of other people have had positive results from it, so maybe it's just me.
There are different types of counselling that people can get, like CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy. So there are different types, and often a counsellor will listen to you and go, right, we're going to try this approach, and it may work or it might not. And sometimes you feel like, oh, this counsellor isn't really working. But often, if you've gone through like the health service, etc., you can't choose who your counsellors are. You kind of like, oh, is my counsellor? Whereas if you pay for it, you can be a bit more selective, but then there's a financial burden, and it's not cheap to go for counselling, particularly people who were struggling. And it's almost like a double whammy, that if you're not doing very well, and maybe you're not in a great financial position because you're not doing very well, it's harder to access the support you need. But I think you've said before that the kind of holistic elements of what Hope Street is has been something that's been really helpful to you.
Yes,
and you've literally you're involved in everything, not everything, but you go to so much of the events and the meetings, etc., that for me, when I think of Hope Street now, I think of Sheila, Dom, and yourself. You're the one who's always there. You're the one who's always at the meetings, who's always got a kind word, who's very supportive of others. And I think that says a lot about you, particularly with your story. I mean, we've been speaking, I think, over an hour now, and your story, I don't think I've ever heard anything like that for one person to go through. And I think the fact that you're here now and you're positive and you want to help others and you're telling this story, I think that speaks volumes about what you are as a person. Where do you see your future now moving forward?
Well, I feel, I mean, as I said before, I've done a whole host of different jobs. I've done admin work, done care work, done retail. I was shop manager. I've been a teaching assistant. You name it, I've done it. But I sometimes feel like I've been working towards something, but I was never sure what I was working towards. And I do feel like I found a vocation in a way. I found something I think that I not only get satisfaction out of, but it helps people. I mean, what more important thing is there in today's society than mental health? I think this is where I am now. I think is where I want to be. I want to be more involved in this. I mean, I'd like. I mean, I think I'd still like to be a best-selling author, but I don't think that's going to happen realistically. So I'd love to do more of a therapeutic side to my writing, which I think I've got some ideas about, but it's just quite hard to put into words. I've got ideas for helping people put the thoughts down on paper. It's a sort of an extension of journaling in a way.
Yeah.
Journaling / creative writing. And that's something I say I have got some ideas for people to help people to structure the thoughts and to express themselves through words.
I think that's a very important coping mechanism, and it might not be for everyone, but journaling, to get the difficult feelings down on paper, you kind of just take a step back then and can analyze them and move forward. And it's also cathartic in its own right. But that's great, and I think that you're bringing your strengths then into that kind of well-being, that desire to be part of a meaningful discussion about well-being moving forward. I just wanted to ask one last question. Given your story, this might sound a little bit general, but what would you say to people going through difficult times? It sounds to me like you've pretty much been through it all. And what would you say to people going through difficult times, for someone who's at that lowest of the low? Have you got any advice or anything that you would say to those people?
I would say, speak to somebody. Who that person is, obviously, who the person you speak to is depends on your own situation. For some people, it could be a parent. Not everyone can speak to the parents. Or it may be a sibling. Not everyone can speak to the siblings. A dear friend. It may, in some people's case, be a professional. So I can't say who the person is that they should speak to, because that's dependent on their own circumstance. But I would say speak to somebody.
Yeah.
Do not internalize it. Do not sit and suffer with it by yourself. You need to speak to somebody. That is the first step and the most important step. All else flows from there. That's what I would say.
I think that's a very important note to finish on. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff here. I mean, we could talk for hours more about a lot of these things, but I just want to thank you, Chris, for coming on and sharing this as part of Hope Street, but also as yourself, and for getting this message out there, your story, to help others and to get these issues out in the open and to talk about them. And I think that your last point there about talking to people, it's so important, and discussing things with other people. I mean, you'll say the same as me. I've had things tear me apart, and then I talk to someone about it and they go, why don't you try this? Or you go, yeah. Or even for some say, yeah, that's a difficult situation. What can we do to try and resolve it? Because there's no easy solutions to it. But to talk about things with someone, it just puts things in perspective, and it can help you get on the journey to becoming a better person. And I think that's important.
You get another point of view as well sometimes. Sometimes the answer they give you is perhaps something that you actually knew yourself, but you weren't able to articulate it. You weren't able to reach out and do it. You needed somebody else to say it.
Yeah, I think Don said sometimes things are hidden in plain sight, about life issues to do with well-being. And as we said earlier, you'll have this stream of consciousness, often a negative voice and all that. But by speaking to someone else or writing about it creatively, journaling, you get it out there, and then you can analyze it, then you can break it down and think about, okay, so what do we do now? But I think that's a great point to end on. But Chris, just want to thank you for sharing your story. It's very moving. You've been through so much. Thanks for being such a positive person. And, I've spoken to you about poetry. I consider you a friend, and the contribution you're making to Hope Street and improving other people's lives and getting this message out there is very important. So thank you very, very much for sharing with us today. And I look forward to spending many, many years working with you moving into the future. So thanks again, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, just a brief note. I will put Samaritans in the notes, and if ever you are feeling really low, or if you've been affected by any of the issues in this podcast, do reach out and speak to others, and do not suffer in silence. Thank you very much.